Well, good morning to everybody. It's good to see you all. I think this is the first day of spring, correct?
Yes.
They said the days are equal, but actually that happened a couple days ago.
Yeah.
It's a refraction of the lights of the days.
The vernal equinox.
Right. So we're going to continue our study in the book of Daniel, and we are in chapter 2. We're going to continue with chapter 2, which is one of the longer chapters here. And we're at verse 19 in chapter 2. It's good to see you all this morning. I hope you're having a good morning. And Brother David, could I call on you to start us off with an opening prayer, please?
Shall we pray? Heavenly Father, Lord, we're so very grateful for this beautiful morning, for another week in your wonderful creation, Lord. And we ask now that you help us to forget about the cares of the world and all the terrible things that seem to be going on, and focus on your word, Lord, and how it might help us to be better in our walk with your Son, Jesus, Lord. Thank you so much for sending him to save us from our sins and be with us throughout this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks, David. So the setting, of course, as we talked about extensively last week, is that Daniel and his three compatriots have been carted off to Babylon. And this is because Nebuchadnezzar has essentially set out to take over the known Eastern Mediterranean world, as it were. And he had surrounded Jerusalem in 605 BC and demanded tribute. And as part of that tribute, he also took some of the smartest of the young people back to serve him in Babylon, along with utensils from the temple. So Daniel goes through the 3-year training period, and at the end of this 3-year training period, he's presented to the king along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the king likes what he hears from these guys, and he puts them into his personal service. The next chapter here is the king has had a dream, and it disturbs him. And we talked about this last week a little bit. You know, most of our dreams, in and out of our heads, we don't think about it. But every once in a while, there's one that comes along that you remember. And he had one of these dreams, and he calls for all the wise men and the sorcerers, the soothsayers, all these guys who claim to have these special talents to be able to interpret things. We have to remember how superstitious the ancient world was. They believed that everything that happened had some kind of secret hidden meaning. And these guys were really good at coming up with ideas of what those meanings were. But the king has a little twist in this. He says, tell me what my dream means. And they say, well, tell us what the dream was. He said, no, you tell me what the dream means. He said, if you're as smart as you guys say you are, he says, you're just wasting my time. He says, you just want to know what the dream is, and then you'll kind of tell me what you think it is. He said, no, if you're smart. And he gets really angry, and he said, that's it, I've had it with you guys. And he tells his chief of his personal bodyguard, he said, that's it, I want all these guys executed. Now, Daniel was not there at that time. He was probably somewhere close by, but he was not in attendance. And he hears about this, so he goes to the chief of the bodyguard. He says, what's going on? He says, well, you guys are all going to die. You're included in that. And he says, well, why? And the answer is because they could not interpret the king's dream. So Daniel gets pretty upset with this. He goes back to his 3 compatriots, and he said, look, we better pray about this. So they pray, and they ask God to help them in this situation. In the exact words that Daniel uses here. Let's see here. Daniel went to his, this is verse 17, went to his house and informed his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, so they may request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men. They asked God for compassion that they not be destroyed. You notice that Daniel did not say, hey, tell me what the interpretation is so I can save our lives. He just said, Lord, have compassion on us. You know, this is Daniel, and then there's Daniel has a night vision, and then Daniel more or less knows what the vision means. So he goes to the head of the bodyguard and says, hey, put me in touch with the king. I think I can do this. I know I can do this, is basically what happens. And so that starts us off here in verse 19. So what we want to do is read this whole section, 19 through 23. 19 through 23. Dan, please.
Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. Through
23.
sorry.
Yep.
He changes times and seasons. He moves kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we ask of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter.
Right. So this is Daniel writing years later, yet he essentially says it's God who provides all these things. And he elaborates on that a little. He says, here, you notice how thankful Daniel is in verse 20. And he says, may God's name be blessed. And this was a common thing back in those days. I mean, we still say this, basically the same thing when we pray. And let me just reinforce one thing here. You know, we often think, we use the term God as, that's a title. He does have a personal name. For many years, the name was not pronounced by the Jews because their thinking was this: if we don't pronounce his name, we can't blaspheme him, because we're not supposed to take his name in vain, the Old Testament says. So the solution is just don't use his name, which is really not good thinking, because if you use a euphemism for the name, that is a nickname, you're still blaspheming who owns that name. As far as scholars know today, the name is Yahweh. It's YHWH, commonly called the Tetragrammaton. I just want you all to, I know I've talked about this before, but I'd like to just review that. So, God is not his name. In many places in your translations, it's the word God. But if you have footnotes, you go back to the beginning of the chapter, the footnotes will say, normally this is YHWH, and it may be translated Yahweh. Sometimes it just say, the word God is used in place of it. But he does have a personal name. So what Daniel is saying here, he says, may God's name be blessed. And he's referring to the name of Yahweh. And it says that God is omniscient and omnipotent. He gives wisdom, knowledge, and he also gives power, or as Dan said, might. He has both things, power and knowledge. And he knows all and has all powerful. So Daniel gives this to God, and then he begins this list in verse 21. And he exemplifies what wisdom and power is. He said, he controls the seasons. He establishes and removes kings. He is he's the author of men's wisdom and knowledge. He is the revealer of what is unknown to man. Of course, in this case, that's exactly what he's doing. He's going to reveal what is unknown. And the darkness cannot hide anything from him. Nothing is hidden from God. This is this omniscient, the ability to know all. So Daniel is elaborating on this and giving credit to God. We will see that throughout the book of Daniel, that Daniel continually goes back and gives the credit to God. And as I said last week, that's one of the most important things. When there's something going on in our lives, and it seems like it's insurmountable, and they're terrible problems, you've got to go back and share it with God. We do this through Jesus Christ. We share it with him. Things get simpler and easier when we do that. In verse 22, he's just continuing this. The revealer of what is unknown to men, darkness cannot hide anything from him. 23, a testament to Daniel's faith. Here, if we read this, he said, and to you, God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise. You have given me wisdom and power. He said, you have wisdom and power, and you have shared that with me. Daniel acknowledges. He didn't get this himself. God has wisdom and power, and he chooses to allow Daniel to have some of that wisdom and power. And Daniel said, I did not know before I had the vision in the night. I did not know what the king's dream was, and I did not know the interpretation of it. Now I not only know what he saw, what the king saw in his vision, but I have an interpretation right from God, the one who gave that vision. So he has the dream, the interpretation, and Daniel uses some places in the book of Daniel, he uses his name, Daniel. He writes from the third person. But you notice here, he says me. He's writing from the first person. And Daniel does this. When it's more historical, he says Daniel and so did this. But now this is his own personal report coming from his heart. Then he says, you have made known to us, including Azariah, Mishael, and why can't I get these guys' names straight? Hananiah. That's why I always call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because I can remember those. I'm sorry. And at the end here, in verse 23, he says, you have given me wisdom and power, but you have made known to us. So this seems to tell me that all four of them knew what the vision was at this point. Daniel may have received it, he shares it, and they all have it. So he's protecting these four men, or young men. So then Daniel in verse 24, let's read 24 and 25. Rachel, Bill, I'll get you next.
Okay, sounds good.
Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation.
Arioch must have trusted Daniel, because he goes in and says, I have found someone who can make this interpretation. He said, I think he may be able to do it, O king. Maybe he can. He said, no, he can do it. So Daniel the wisdom and power that God grants has given Daniel the ability to forthrightly say, I can do this. And he has that presence about him. There's no doubt in Daniel's mind that he can do this. I think Arioch senses that in some way. This is a man of substance. Even though he was younger, he probably still wasn't only maybe about 20 years old at this time. There was something about Daniel. And I think this is God watching out for Daniel and the other three. He gives him that presence before authority, if you will. The ability not to be braggadocio, but to say, I know what I'm doing. I know what this is, and I can solve this problem. So Arioch goes before the king, and then we get to the beginning where we first hear Nebuchadnezzar speaking, and we're in his presence now. Up until this time, he's a figure. We haven't been in his presence. Daniel may have seen him before and everything, but we as the readers, we haven't had any personal contact with Nebuchadnezzar. So now we get to see something about the character of Nebuchadnezzar. And Bill, would you read, let's see here, verses 27 and 28.
Okay. Are you sure? I don't think we read 26 yet.
Did we do 26?
No.
Oh, no, that's where we're going to start. 26, 27, and 28.
Yes.
Thank you.
The king asked Daniel, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret? Daniel replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he had asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you were lying in bed are these.
So Daniel says, the king says, can you do this? And Daniel says, what? He says, no, I can't. Right? And this is basically what he says. He said, no, I can't do that. He says, but there is a God. Now, we assume that Nebuchadnezzar has heard about the God of the Hebrews. I mean, he's conquering their nation. They tend to know everything about the nation they're going to conquer. And when he says there is a God, Nebuchadnezzar said, well, yeah, this is the God that you're familiar with. But he does ask him this question. Are you able to make known to me the dream? So he's talking straight to him. And here we have Daniel's name is Belteshazzar. And this is what he would be known to everybody in Babylon. He would be called Daniel. He'd be called Belteshazzar. Or Belteshazzar. And so Daniel says, yeah, I can do this in the long run. This is basically what he's saying. I can do this because God has allowed me to do this. And then I'll do the last 29 and 30. He says, as for you, O king, he says, as for you, while on your bed, your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future. And he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. Now, from this, I get the idea that the king was thinking about tomorrow, the next day, weeks, years to come. And he was the most powerful ruler in that whole Mediterranean and even as far as what we know today is past Iraq into almost India, north to the Black Sea, and then south down to the ocean, and all the way over to Egypt in the west. And he's thinking about, okay, where do we go from here? What happens now? What happens after I'm gone? What happens to my nation, my empire, if you will? So he's thinking about these things, and he falls asleep. And this is where God has been listening to him, thinking, and God intercedes, and God gives him this. But as he said, and God who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. He hasn't told you specifically, but he has given you this image. And this is where Nebuchadnezzar has the problem. Okay, you could say, yeah, that's exactly what happened. But what does it mean? What can I draw from this picture that I have? But as for me, the mystery has not been revealed to me through any, and again, Daniel's reinforcing, he wants the king to know, hey, this is not me. I am simply the messenger. This is what he's saying here in verse 30. Not any wisdom residing in me more than any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. This is interesting because he says you may understand the thoughts of God, but it doesn't say that. He says the thoughts of your mind. So he's giving credit to Nebuchadnezzar to have the foresight to begin to think about the future. Where do we go from here? And that's part of what the king's job should be. What happens tomorrow? How do I take care of my kingdom? How do I do all these things? And God intercedes and gives him the information. And that brings us to the king's dream. And that's verses 31 through 35. And I need a reader for that. Glenda, do you feel like reading for us? Amanda, I'll get you next if you want to read.
You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. The statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth.
Right. Thank you, Lord. So now Daniel is recounting what the king saw. And Dan, would you go and look in the office? Jim's got a poster. I forgot to bring that out here. It's a poster of this statue. I don't know where it is in there. I forgot to look for it. And it is a stupendous thing. It's made out of the finest material. So the head is gold, and then the torso is silver. Around the lower section and the thighs here, it's bronze, and then the legs iron, and then the feet of iron and clay. Well, and the king can say, yeah, okay, that's what I saw, but what does it mean? But Daniel wants to make sure he's recounting these things, not only for us, but so that the king understands that Daniel has the same picture in his mind that the king has, that there's no discrepancies. Daniel wants to make it very, very clear that what God has revealed to him is exactly what the king saw. So the king said, well, you didn't talk about this. What about that? What about this? So the idea here is that Daniel, again, Daniel's a kind of a detailed guy. Okay, there we go. All right. And this is from the World Video Bible School. Okay, so I passed this around. It's kind of difficult for you in the back to see, but you can get a look at it. And it's done in the Babylonian style of when they depicted their leaders. They had these very combed beards, if you will, and so on. So we'll take a look at that and then pass it on back. You can take a look at that. So, and again, Daniel's being very thorough. So in verse 31 is this awesome statue. The head is gold, arms and torso silver, midsection and thighs bronze, legs iron, feet of clay, uncut, and then a stone. And this is the curious thing: a stone uncut by hands. It means this is not man-made. Simply, what's that telling us is that stone is made something other than mankind. This is not a human piece of human ingenuity in any way. And what does it do? Well, first thing it does is it crushes the feet of, well, the king is saying, yeah, I saw that. And then it takes the rest of it and it grinds it. Now, chaff, most of you know what chaff is. You take a kernel of wheat, you take the outer covering off. That's the chaff. It's the part we don't normally eat, all right? And it's very light in weight. It's a very good covering for a living seed inside. But once it's taken off, it's lightweight. And the wind, a mild breeze can blow it away. And on the threshing floors, you've all seen pictures of them. They have a basket with wheat in it. And they kind of throw it up in the air like this. And what happens is the kernels that you want fall down back into the basket. But the chaff blows away. And you keep doing that. What they don't tell you is prior to that, they had the wheat on the floor and they're beating it. And what they're doing is breaking the outer covering from the seed kernel. And they do that. There's a name for it in Hebrew, and I can't remember the name for it, but it looks like a broomstick with a piece of rope on it with a flat little paddle of wood. And they go like this, and they're beating on a little pile of wheat. And they put it in the basket, throw it all up in the air, and the wind takes the chaff away, and you're left with the pure kernels. So it's an interesting timing, lengthy process. Imagine you've got bushels and bushels of wheat you got to do this. You're going to be in there for a while. But the idea is the chaff, everybody knows chaff gets blown away. It's not what we want to eat. It's the part that's excess. And this is what happens to the gold and the silver and the bronze and the iron and the clay. All of it is just gone. And it's done by this stone that is uncut by hand. So you can see the king saying, oh, yeah, give me more. This is exactly what I saw. Because Daniel's painting this word picture. And the king is agreeing with it. He said, yeah, okay. This is what I saw. Because if it wasn't what the king saw, he would have interjected by now, right? He would have said, wait a minute, that's not what I saw. So we have this, through silence, we have this agreement. And in, let's see here. And verse 35, then the iron and the clay and so on and so forth. Okay, so that brings us up to verse 36. And this was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation. And now the king, you can see him moving toward the edge of the seat, right? I mean, he's not only being entertained, but he's being educated. This is the thing. Even the greatest king at that time realizes he does not know. And he finds somebody who claims to know, and what does he do? Give me more. This is, Nebuchadnezzar did not get to be king because he was stupid. Because he was able to see if men knew something, he wanted to know what they knew. He wanted to fill that vacuum in his own knowledge. He's quite a character. He's painted as the invader of Judah. But there's a lot more to Nebuchadnezzar here than most people give him credit for. He was a pretty good ruler compared to a lot of the other despots and dictators in the world. He was pretty good. He knew how to administer to this big nation that he had, a kingdom. So Amanda, did you want to read, did you have your hand up before? Okay, verses 36 through 38, please.
This was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hands and has caused you to rule over them. You are the head of gold.
Okay, he just doesn't say, you're the head of gold. He gives him a lesson. Right here, those 3 verses, right here. He could have even said, well, you're the head of gold. And the king said, yeah, I know the head of gold. I'm the king of this whole empire. But he gives them a lesson about God and about how God works. You're the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given you. In other words, yeah, you're the king of kings, but you got that because God has chosen to give you that. You didn't get this because you're a great general and you're a good king and all these other things. But it all comes from God. God is the owner of all these things. He not only gave you the kingdom, but he gave you the power and the strength and the glory to be able to manage this kingdom. What you have is given to you by God. It's exactly what we can say about each one of us today. What we have and what we've made of ourselves is because God has given us these things. That is a universal lesson that mankind refuses to acknowledge. But Daniel knew it, and he's given the king the lesson. Now here's a 20-year-old kid, right? And he's slapping some learning on Nebuchadnezzar. And the king is sitting there, and he's listening, but this is the measure. He could have gotten very indignant. What do you mean? I did this myself. Now later on, Nebuchadnezzar does get in trouble for doing that, but not at this point. He's listening. And Daniel is using this opportunity to preach the good word. God has given you these things. And whenever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he's given them all into your hand, everything. And caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. It's pretty interesting, isn't it, the way he includes the whole creation. He says, good, you have, in your palm of your hand, you have the authority and the power and the wisdom over the whole creation, that God has given that into your hand.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the Garden of Eden, it sounds like what Adam and Eve had, so
well,
it's pretty powerful.
When you look at the empire that Nebuchadnezzar had, he had all the elements in there, and they kind of scattered all over. Some things weren't there, like the tree of knowledge and of good and evil and things like that. We find them in the book of Revelation many thousands of years later, a couple thousand years later, but anyhow. So the idea of us, whenever that happens is where it's going to be. So he's doing this. Now, so Babylon is, the kingdom of Babylon is the head of gold. And Daniel continues. And after you, there'll be another kingdom inferior to you. It won't have the complete control over everything. It may be smaller, its administration may not be as good. We don't know what the total inferior, but it's be less than the sum of the kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar rules over. Then a third kingdom of bronze, and which will rule over all the earth. And then there'll be a fourth one in verse 40. So we get the idea that each one is something less than the one before it. And then, in verse 40, it says that the fourth kingdom, strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these things. And then in verse 41, it talks about the feet being of iron and clay. Now, iron and clay don't mix. You can form them together, but they do not bond. Where you can take gold and silver, you can get them to form a bond, and you can take silver and get it to form a bond with brass, and it'll come apart. But iron and clay, you tap it with a hammer, and it comes apart. It's there, it looks the part, but it's not bonded well. So what does all this stuff mean? Well, today we know that the head of gold was Babylon. Well, what comes next? Well, it's the Medo-Persian Empire. And the Medes and the Persians take over Babylon, and they become the main you want to say, political, economic, and military force in that area. After them comes the Greeks with Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great with the Greek Empire. And the Greek Empire eventually gives forth to 4 sub-empires. One of them being Egypt, one of them Syria, another one over in India, and then the one up near where Greece is. And his 4 generals took those areas over when Alexander the Great died. He didn't live very long. I think it was 28 when he died. And so the Greek Empire gives rise to those 4. But then after that comes the last one. And this is the one that has the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay. And that's the Roman Empire. And the Romans ruled with an iron fist, if you will. Right? I mean, they went out, when the legions went out, they conquered. I mean, they just conquered everything, all the way from where France is, into England, up north, as far north as parts of, into Scotland, and then across into Europe, all the way up through the Netherlands, Holland, the Netherlands, and that area, into parts of Germany, and then they went east also. So they ruled, but they had a problem, because they began to grow in the Roman Empire a great dichotomy. We won't use the word dichotomy, it means something in 2 parts, dicot, okay? D-I and cot, 2 parts. And what it was is the ruling aristocracy, and then everybody else. And these guys did not get along. They tried to initially, when the Roman Empire was established, to have a Roman, they call itself a republic. And it had a senate. But that devolved into having a king, Caesar. And the word Caesar is synonymous with this is where the Russian word czar comes from, okay? And the German word Kaiser, they all mean the same things. Caesar, Kaiser, czar, it means the supreme head, the supreme authority. So what happened then, when you start having that supreme authority in Rome, all of a sudden this guy's saying, I'm not only the king, I am the emperor of the Roman Empire, but I'm also God. And this is where you get guys like Caligula and all the successive ones being worshipped and having temples put up to them. That they were worshipped while they were alive. They were also assassinated, almost every one of them. So that didn't work out too good for them. But the idea is you had this great difference between the general populace and the royalty. And what happens is then you have great revolutions taking place inside. That's the feet and the clay. They don't go together. They don't bond together. Even though the legs are iron, very strong, it's from internal. It falls apart internally. If you have a statue and you don't have good feet on the statue, what happens to the statue? It falls over. There's no base to it. This is what happened to the Roman Empire. And almost every empire that has succeeded from that point on has not been conquered from without. It falls apart first inside. Its geopolitical formations crumble. And one of the first things to go in that situation is the nuclear family. You go back and look at all these histories, you find out that there was a devaluation of mom, dad, and kids, and then extended families from there. They devalued that, and they be, well, it's okay. You want to go live with your boyfriend, and you know, you're a guy, but you're going to call him your husband, and he's going to call you your husband, and you that's fine. Or you 2 ladies want to go and be husband and wife, or wife and wife, that's fine. Matter of fact, if you want to marry your horse, you can do that too. So they began to devalue that, and that's why Rome fell apart. So Rome lasted for, as we know it, for approximately 400 years. And it was so disorganized and so falling apart inside that anybody could walk in. Even the barbaric tribes, the Goths, the Visigoths, and all these came in. These guys, they weren't organized. They were just violent. And they came in and they took over the Roman Empire. So they moved the seat of Rome, then moved to Constantinople or Istanbul, as we know it today. So there's a real lot of history involved with this. And this is what Daniel is alluding to here. And in verse 41, you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom. This is Rome, a divided kingdom. And it will not have in it the toughness of iron as much as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. When Rome went into Gaul, which is common day France, they didn't get an equanimous agreement between the residents of France or Gaul and Rome. They took them militarily, with violence. So there was always a resistance faction living in Gaul. When they went into England, the same thing. When they went into Germany, they really had problems. Those guys were really barbaric. They would rather die fighting than live. So the Germanic tribes were never completely conquered as some of the other ones were. And this also is applied to the clay, because the conquered people, you know why they were called barbarians? Anybody know? There's one measuring stick that the Romans used. Do they grow olive trees? I know it seems foolish. If you can't grow olive trees, you must be barbaric, because the olive oil was one of the main trades that the Romans engaged in. And if you can't grow olive trees, you're barbarian. So that's, and I don't know exactly where the word barbarian came from. But the idea is anybody who did not have, as part of their agricultural structure, olive trees. Well, if you go north, the olive trees can't grow. They're not hardy in the northern climate. All those are barbarians. Didn't matter where they came from or what their political structure was, they're barbarians. And as you went into the desert areas to the east of Rome, it's too dry for olive oils. Well, they're barbarians too. So Rome treated all these people, and they looked down upon them. And because of this, well, look what happened in Jerusalem. All right? Yeah, they had olive trees in Jerusalem. But the Jews were rebellious. They were constantly rebelling against the Romans. And we know what happened there. Eventually, Rome says, that's enough. And they send Titus and his troops in at about 66 BC. And by 70 BC, Jerusalem was essentially no more. It was gone. There was nothing left of Jerusalem. And the interesting thing here is that in Jerusalem, when they destroyed the temple, that was God's stamp of approval that the old law was now officially done with. And the reasoning is this: if you're a Jew, you are commanded twice a year to go to the temple to offer sacrifices. And every day there were animal sacrifices at the temple. There was the morning sacrifice and the afternoon sacrifice. When you don't have a temple, you can't do those things. And if you can't do those things, you are not in compliance with the old law. And if you're not in compliance with the old law, then you're not acceptable to God under the old law. This is God's, I sent you my son. What'd you do? You killed him. Okay. You got a few years here. Get it right. And many of the Jews did in Jerusalem because they had heard the apostles, they had heard Jesus. But the great majority of them did not. So God finally says, okay, you still want to be a Jew? Let me see you be a Jew under the old law with no temple. And to this very day, that is exactly why that temple will never be rebuilt again. They talk about it all the time. It's never going to be, God will not permit that temple to be rebuilt. The other thing is, there's no Jewish priesthood. All those records from the lineages from Aaron and the Levitical priest is gone. Nobody knows who's from the Levitical heritage. You don't have that. And you had to have that to be a priest according to the old law. You had to be able to recite your lineage and prove that you came from the Levites. And you can't do that. No one can. There's no writing to prove that. So you can't do it. And yet people today still say, well, I'm a practicing Jew. But we know how that works out for you when you stand before the bar. I sent you my son, I took away the temple, and you have no lineage of record for your priesthood. How do you explain being a practicing Jew? Well, we didn't think you would mind. Or the rabbi told me this. The guy said, do you ever, what's inside this cranium of yours, your brain? Do you ever use it? So God sends, and we talked about this in Luke, the landowner, and he sends his slaves to collect the rent, and if they mistreat them, they say, I'll send my son. And they kill him. This is Jesus. And the workers there, the farmers who had that land in the vineyard, that's the Jews, particularly the Jewish leadership. Oh, we'll solve this problem. We'll kill the heir, and we'll inherit this. The logic that doesn't work. But God was saying, this is how illogical you guys are. I've given you all the messages, all the prophecies have been fulfilled in my son Jesus, and you still won't listen. So anyhow, back to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's listening to this, and he's appreciating what's going on here. And he realizes that as the head of gold, eventually it'll come to an end. But I think he's fascinated by this story that Daniel's telling him about how these other empires will come to be, but they also will be destroyed by this rock if I was Nebuchadnezzar, I'd say, tell me more about the rock. How is this something? It's not cut by hand. We know that every rock ever used for any construction is cut by masons. They get in there and they chip it and they make it the size it needs to be and they use it. How do you have one uncut by hand? Well, who gave Daniel the knowledge and the wisdom to be able to interpret this? God. So God is cutting that rock. And when we start talking about rocks, I would invite you to go with me to Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, if you just want to turn to that. Matthew 16, 18. And Rachel, if you have that, could you read that for us, please? Matthew 16, 18.
I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Okay, we're talking about rocks here, right? What he really says is, you are Petros. Petros is a tiny little rock. You're a little stone. You're a little pebble. And it's not you, but it's about what did Peter just do? Peter made the good confession. Right? If you go back a few verses, Peter says, you are the living God. So he says, upon this confession, I'm going to build my church. That's what he calls Peter a little rock. And he says, but upon this rock, and that's Petra, that's a giant, solid boulder. I wonder if that's not the same boulder that was uncut by human hands, the same stone uncut by human hands, right? Upon this rock, I'm going to build my church. Psalm 118:22. Maybe somebody look that up. Psalm 118:22. David, you got that one?
Oh,
Okay.
Psalm 118:22.
Yeah, and then I need, let's see, Anita, look up Mark 12, verses 1 through 11. Okay, Psalm 118:22.
The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone.
Another stone. Now, what is a cornerstone? Cornerstone is a piece of granite, or any kind of stone, actually. They use whatever's at hand. But it was cut at 90-degree angles, every corner, exactly square. Whether it was a square or a rectangle, everything was nice and smooth. And when you would set that on the corner of the building, and you would sight along the edge, run a string out there and get it perfectly even with that edge, that's one wall of the building. And then you come over here and sight it along this edge, and it would give you that. And you'd pace off a number of feet, and then you could make the 2 ends meet, and you'd have a square or rectangle building. That's the cornerstone from which everything else is measured, everything else is built on. And in the Psalm, it says the cornerstone that the builders rejected, because the builders would go to the quarry and they'd look, oh, we don't want that one. It's got a little blemish in it, it's this and that. The builders were the leaders of the Jews, and they rejected Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ is the cornerstone of Christianity, and they rejected that. Okay, now there's a long passage in Mark, and we've got enough time. Would you read that, Anita?
What is it?
It's Mark 12, 1 through 11.
And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it, and dug it back under the winepress and built a tower, and rented it out to the vine growers and went on a journey. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers in order to receive some of the produce of the vineyard from the vine growers. They took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent them another slave, and they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and and that one they killed. So with many others, feeding some and killing others. And he had one more to send, a beloved son. He sent him last of all to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those vine growers said to one another, this is the heir, come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. They took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine growers and will give the vineyard to others. Have you not even read the scripture? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous. In our eyes.
Thank you. See how it all goes together? You've got a stone uncut from hands in the Old Testament. In Psalms in the Old Testament, it talks about this chief cornerstone. Mark and Luke bring it back in. They record the same parable, slightly different terminology, but it's the same parable you find in Luke and Mark. And in Mark, he said, it's the chief cornerstone which has been rejected. That's the Son. And the leaders of the Jews rejected it. So we have this continuance from the Old Testament forward. And the image of a stone is something that the ancient peoples could understand as much as we understand. A stone, what happens if you have a stone, guy drops a stone in your pathway, and it's night, and you're carrying your groceries in the house. Ooh, you stumble over it, right? Because but now you know it's there. Now you go around it, you look at it, or you move it, you do something with it. The Jews stumbled over this chief cornerstone time and time again. Now there are some of the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees who got it right, Nicodemus and a few others. But for the majority of them, they were evil-minded men who were more involved with maintaining their position as the leaders than they were hearing the truth. Nebuchadnezzar's not like that, is he? Nebuchadnezzar's listening. He's paying attention. You can see a difference there. Anyhow, it's time for us to quit. So next week we will pick up with verse 44. Thanks so much.